My blissful selves. Today, let us know about the remembrance of one's true self. What happens if we remember our true self? Man desires for happiness. Why desires for happiness? Because he has not got happiness. And he only desires happiness only because he has come from happiness. His original home is happiness only. And he can end his life journey by returning back to his original home. And that can be achieved by remembrance of one's own true self. But usually, man is remembering the sensory objects. And when he remembers sensory objects, so there will be contact of the sensory object. And when there is contact of the sensory objects, he feels that the sensory objects are givers of bliss. And there arises the desire to obtain the sensory objects. If the desired object is not obtained, or if anyone becomes obstacle to obtain the desired object, sensory object, or if anyone snatches away the sensory object, then arises the anger. When the anger arises, the power of discrimination of the intellect is destroyed. The particular person will not be in a position to know what is right and what is wrong, what is self and what is non-self, what is true and what is untrue. And in the fit of anger, he will be in a position to talk very vulgar words and commits sinful actions. And the result is he will be in a position to get the lower births, like the plants, the worms, the insects, the birds, and the beasts. So these will be in a position to eat the fishes, but they don't know that they are eating the fishes. then he will be in a position to enjoy the sensory objects. So when one will be enjoying the sensory objects, he understands that they are the givers of bliss. And there arises the infatuation, the moha for the sensory objects. So like that, the desire, kama, anger, krodha, and now infatuation, moha. So three enemies originate in the mind. And if the number of sensory objects will be more, one can get more happiness. So that's how the person becomes greedy, lobha. And then he thinks that he is the only person in the world who has been in a position to enjoy maximum number of sensory objects. He becomes very egoistic, and there arises the egoism. And if there will be any other person who is enjoying the sensory objects more than him, in him arises the jealousy, matsara. Like this, the six enemies, kama, krodha, moha, lobha, mada, matsara, will arise in our mind. When we remember the sensory objects, so the six enemies arise in our mind. Even there will be enemies outside. Usually, we quarrel with our neighbors. Why we quarrel with our neighbors? We quarrel with our neighbors only for sensory objects. That means by remembering the sensory objects, there arise six enemies in the mind, and even outside there will be enemies. The neighbors will be our enemies. Like this, if we remember the sensory objects, so there arise six enemies in the mind, and in the outside also there will be enemies. And there will be no happiness at all. So if we forget the sensory objects, what happens? If we forget the sense objects, so there will be no contact of the sensory objects. And if there is no contact, there will be no desire of the sensory objects. And there will be no question of anger whether the desired sensory objects have been caught, or anybody will be in a position to become obstacle to obtain the sensory objects, or anyone will be in a position to snatch the sensory objects. So there will be no question of anger. And as there will be no anger. There is no question of destruction of the power of discrimination of the intellect. And as such, the sense enjoyment will not only be continued, there will be no infatuation, there will be no greed, and there will be no egoism, and there will be no jealousy. If we forget the sensory objects, so there will be no six enemies as kama, krodha, moha, lobha, mada, matsara. And even there will be no enemies in the outside. If we forget the sensory objects, there will be no enemies in the mind, and there will be no enemies outside. And if we remember our own true self, what happens? Our own true self is of the nature of happiness. That means we become contacted with happiness only. And when we get happiness, so there will be no desire of happiness. So there will be no karma. And there will be no question of krodha, because already we have got the happiness. And there will be no desire to get happiness. So there will be no anger. And there will be no destruction of the discriminative power of the intellect. And no indulgence or sensory enjoyment of sensory objects. There will be no infatuation. There will be no greed. There will be no egoism. And there will be no jealousy. And not only that, there will be no enemies in the outside also. So if we remember our true self, which is of the nature of happiness, so we'll experience permanent happiness. So if we want to experience permanent happiness, we have to remember our own true self. And if we remember the sensory objects, we will not be in position to obtain the permanent happiness. If at all we are to attain permanent happiness, so we have to eradicate the desires of the sensory objects of this world, Iharoka, and the other world, that is Paraloka. So the infatuation that is there in our mind, so it has to be completely eradicated if at all we have to attain permanent happiness. And if that is the case, how exactly we can eradicate or destroy the desires or the infatuation of the sensory objects of this world or the other world? So if we'll be in a position to inquire where exactly the happiness is. So the sense enjoyment of sensory objects leads to tiresomeness and weariness. Why it leads to tiresomeness and weariness? Because there is no happiness at all in the sensory objects. And not only that, if we have to experience the permanent happiness, we have to transcend the body consciousness. So the body consciousness is the main reason for unhappiness. And if we inquire whether we are this gross body or not, we will come to know that we are not this gross body. When we are living, so we talk. But when we die, we don't talk. Why? Because the talking person has left this gross body. That means we are talking persons. And for talking, there is the necessity of consciousness. If there is consciousness, then only we can talk. That means we are not this gross body. We are not the subtle body, the so-called Linga Sharira, which has been made up of 5 organs of action, 5 organs of knowledge, 5 pranas, the mind, the intellect, the chitta, the remembering entity, and egoism, the so-called ahankara. We have been in a position to know the gross body, and that is how we are not the gross body. We know the 5 organs of action, that is hands, legs, mouth, anus, the generative organ. We also know the 5 organs of knowledge, eyes, nose, tongue, touch, and the word, like that. That means we are not the 5 organs of knowledge. And there are 5 pranas in the subtle body. And we know the 5 pranas also. We say, hey, there is gas production is there. That means we know the pranas. Prana, apana, vyana, samana, udana. We also know the mind. We say, my mind is no good today. And my intellect, buddhi, is disturbed today. Like that, we know the mind. We know the intellect. We know the chitta, the remembering entity. I can remember what he explained. No, I cannot remember like that. That means we know the chitta. And we also know the egoism. I did this action, I didn't do that action. Like that, even I know the egoism. So I am not the ego. I am not the gross body. I am not the organs of action. I am not the organs of knowledge. I am not the 5 pranas. I am not the mind, the intellect. the remembering entity, and the egoism. I am the knower of all these. For knowing anything, there is the necessity of consciousness. And I am consciousness. And consciousness is of the nature of happiness. In deep sleep, there is only consciousness. We say there was nobody in the deep sleep. And if we have to say there was nobody in the sleep, I am the knower that there was nobody. I didn't know anything in deep sleep. That means I am the knower of I didn't know anything in deep sleep. In deep sleep, there was happiness. So I am the knower of the happiness that has been known during a deep sleep. So in this way, I am not the known, but I am the knower. And my nature is consciousness. And consciousness itself is happiness or bliss. If at all we have to become permanently happy, so we have to remember our true self. So to say, we have to meditate diligently, continuously, our true self. The realized one say, Dhyana vastita tadgatena manasa pashyanti yamayogino yashantam na vidu sura surajana devaya tasmai namaha. When a person will be in a position to meditate continuously, so first of all, we have to listen of our true self, Sravana. After listening our true self, then we have to reflect, that is manana. And lastly, nididhyasana. We have to be firmly residing in our true self. Atma samstam mana krutva na kinchidapi chintayet. As we take 2 meals a day, even in the morning and evening, and working people, so they will be in a position to take meal 3 times, like that. In the same way, in the morning we have to listen about this, reflect over it, and we have to stand still, firmly in our true self. Morning 1 hour and evening 1 hour. And this duration and this time has to be increased gradually. Morning 2 hours, evening 2 hours, like that. Even in the middle. And again we can increase 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the evening. Like this, if we try to know our true self, lastly, we will attain the super conscious state. That means Turya Avastha. That means Dhyana Samadhi. In a Dhyana Samadhi, the concerned individual loses the body consciousness, loses the world consciousness, and he will be only conscious about his true self. Atma samstam mana krutva na kinchidapi chintayet. When we stand still in our true self, we will experience permanent happiness. So this is the only way to attain permanent happiness. If at all we have to experience permanent happiness, continuously we have to remember our true self. Then only we'll experience permanent happiness. And if there will be desires, to enjoy the sensory objects, so there will be rebirth again. Realized one say, Ragadim Birinnu Bhavabijamunde. If you will have desires to enjoy the sensory objects, there will be rebirth. And if you will have the body consciousness, without the body, you cannot enjoy the sensory objects. So we have to transcend the body consciousness. So to know our true self, we have to destroy the desires of sensory objects of this world and the other world. And we have to transcend our body consciousness. We are not at all these bodies, but we are consciousness. Realized one say, Arivu tanendu nambi nindode mukti, taratilla vendudu nigamukti. Deha bhava adiye dukkada kedu. When the body consciousness is transcended, and when the desires for sensory objects have been destroyed completely, one ends one's journey completely. If you go to Dharwad and Hubli, so we have completed only 1 day journey. But the Jivana journey has to be ended, And if at all we have to end the journey of our own Jiva, so compulsorily we have to attain this super conscious state or the Jnana Samadhi, and there will be no rebirth. The body will not at all be born, and we will not at all be unhappy by the body concerned. So by this I end my speech.